Hi, I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground. Welcome to this week's episode of The Underground, a program that explores the testimony of the biblical prophets, the gospel of Jesus Christ, current events, and how all of these things relate to you and me. Now, in this week's episode, I want to take a brief look at some crazy things that are unfolding in Turkey. Well, just the past couple weeks, if you've been following the news, you've seen that the prime minister, his name was Ahmet Davutoglu, that he has been removed from office. Now, this is huge news. If you follow what's going on in Turkey, this is huge news because the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is consolidating his power, his absolute autocratic power, his dictatorship over this nation. And so what's unfolding in Turkey right now is incredible. So Davutoglu, well, he was basically the architect. He was this college professor that wrote a book called Strategic Depth, where he really laid out the game plan, the blueprint for the present Islamist party in Turkey, the AKP party, to rise to power. And President Erdogan, he rose to power side by side with Davutoglu, eventually putting him into the seat of the prime minister as the premier. Well, apparently Davutoglu was not obedient enough to Erdogan, and as a result, he has been forced out, and we will now have sort of a puppet premier who will replace him. But listen to this headline. As Davutoglu exits, Erdoganists, they're the ones who are following the current president Erdogan, they demand obedience to the leader. Please listen to this. The concept of a leader and absolute obedience to this leader exists in our faith and in our state tradition. What is being said here? Within Islamic theology, when a caliph comes into a power, a khalifa, the caliph is sort of the pope, president, and general of the Islamic world. He's essentially the religious, military, and political leader, all wrapped up into one head, into one office. And when a caliph comes into office, as we just saw with ISIS, all of the Muslims are obligated to make the pledge. It's called the bay'ah. It's the pledge of allegiance to the caliph. And so we've seen different Islamist groups all over the Islamic world, all the way from Northern Africa, all the way over to Pakistan, making the pledge, these various jihadists making the bay'ah pledge. They pledge their life, complete obedience to the caliph. And so long as he obeys and implements Sharia, the Islamic law, all Muslims are, according to that law, obligated to follow him and serve him. So that's the theological basis for subservience to the caliph in Islam, but even more so in Turkey, where Turkey eventually assumed the headship of the caliphate, the Islamic government. The Ottoman Empire was really the Ottoman Caliphate. The sultans, they became the new caliphs. And so the office of sultan and caliph, they're essentially one and the same. Sultan is basically a Turkish caliph, the head of the Ottoman Empire. And so subservience to the sultan, subservience to the caliph is one and the same. So here you have a mayor in the nation of Turkey saying absolute obedience to Erdogan is mandatory, not just for those who support him, but for all Turks and all Muslims. Folks, what is happening in Turkey? If you're to listen to a lot of the various Bible prophecy teachers out there, they'll say, Joel, we don't really need to be paying attention to Turkey. The real locus of satanic power, the real place that we really need to be paying attention to, the real place that Ezekiel was talking about, that's Russia. And you've had some guys that have come pretty much out and said that Putin is Gog. I mean, they've basically all but inferred it. And I'm not saying that Erdogan is Gog. But what I'm saying is we do need to be paying attention to Turkey because it's out of Turkey. It's out of this culture, this society, this geography, this region that I believe we will see the emergence of the Antichrist. And again, I'm not saying that Erdogan is the Antichrist. But if he's not, I mean, anyone could, he is certainly emerging as a clear foreshadow of the Antichrist. And even if you don't believe in Bible prophecy, we need to be paying attention to what's happening in Turkey because the geopolitical ramifications are dramatic. But back to the Bible prophecy teachers, what these guys are saying is, no, Joel, you have it all wrong because you have misinterpreted the names. You've misunderstood the names in Ezekiel's prophecy. Now listen, and if you have not read my book, Mideast Beast, please get it. If you're interested in biblical prophecy, please get my book. I'll go ahead and put a special up on my website where you can get the book and a DVD with it, where I have a few sessions where I teach on Gog, Magog. I've got 3 chapters in Mideast Beast where I deal with this in depth. I mean, painstaking detail. Make it very clear that Ezekiel is simply talking about the Antichrist, that Gog is the Antichrist, and that the Antichrist clearly comes out of the region of Greater Turkey. So I'd encourage you to get those things. But if you haven't read those things, then please hear me, because essentially what I am when I do this, I'm almost like the guy who's a magician who then comes out and makes a DVD where he exposes all of the other magicians. Because quite often, if you're just a student of Bible prophecy, it's kind of like reading all of these prophecy teachers who are working through all of the commentaries and the Bible dictionaries and the atlases and all of the historical resources. It's almost like magic because you sort of just have to put your faith that in what they're saying is true. Unfortunately, what a lot of the guys do is they just sort of parrot or imitate or follow the teachers before them. So in the same way that a lot of people's views of what Ezekiel is being said is just formed by having read their favorite teacher, and listen, this is understandable, everyone does this, many of the teachers themselves do the same thing. And this is the problem, is we need to be Bereans. We need to be careful students of history and the scriptures. Listen, if Paul the Apostle, if he praised the Bereans because they checked out what he said, then how much more should we check out what we read in some popular prophecy teachers' books, right? So there are 2 methods. Here comes the opening up the magic. Here's how it's done so that you yourself can do the magic. There's really 2 methods of interpretation. The first one is this sort of bloodline lineage migration method. I call it the historical wild goose chase. So what that means is this. You've got the various names that Ezekiel lists. You've got Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah. You've got Persia, Cush, and Put. You've got all these different names. Well, what do they mean? How do we understand what Ezekiel was saying? Well, the first method that some people use is this historical wild goose chase. So let's say we're dealing with Gomer. Well, what they try to do is trace the Gomerite peoples. Who did Gomer become? What tribes did they become? Who did they intermarry with? Where did they live? Where did they migrate? Where did they move? And you're essentially trying to trace the DNA, the bloodline of the ancient biblical Gomerite peoples down through history. I mean, a couple thousand years. I mean, actually 4,000 or 5,000 years trying to identify them. And then we become subject to the very limited resources that we have, the limited historical resources, the various ancient historians, and this sort of thing. And there becomes all sorts of debatable material. I mean, obviously, there's much to be debated here. And we lose parts of history because we don't have just a sort of, comprehensive history of the world. We can try to piece it together. We can look at various ancient sources, but it almost becomes a little bit hopeless. At the best we have is guesswork. Now, the other problem with this is that when we look at the various peoples in Ezekiel's prophecy and we trace them down, we end up with pretty much the whole world because the peoples in Ezekiel's prophecy eventually came to be dispersed all over the world. Okay, so I would argue that this whole wild goose chase method is a bad method. It's a bad method. We're not trying to trace DNA and bloodline. Instead, what we should be using is the standard evangelical approach to interpreting Scripture, which is the historical grammatical method or the grammatical historical method, which is to say that we are studying and working through the actual grammar, the language of the text, as well as the historical context. And so what this translates to is we try to understand, how did Ezekiel and his immediate audience understand the names? How did Ezekiel and those who first heard his oracle understand these various names? Now, Ezekiel was a Hebrew prophet. He grew up as a thoroughly biblically literate individual, and so his worldview was formed and fashioned by the Table of Nations. And the Table of Nations is in Genesis 10, going into Genesis 11. So most of the names, almost all of the names listed in Ezekiel's oracle are actually in Genesis's Table of Nations. And so these are sort of the ancient homelands of all of the peoples that are mentioned. Now, some people will say, well, but Joel, the people dispersed, and so really Ezekiel would have been looking to where the people lived in his day. I would agree with that. It really is sort of a mixture between the ancient homelands, as they would have been understood by any biblically literate individual, and trying to understand where they lived in Ezekiel's day. So those are really the two factors in terms of understanding the names. Now, because again, let's just say someone said, the Americans are going to attack, Papua New Guinea. The Americans are going to attack Papua New Guinea. And so someone comes along a couple thousand years and they go, well, where did the Americans live? And someone could easily say, well, Americans lived all over the world. Yes, Americans are dispersed all over the world, just like many of the peoples in Ezekiel's prophecy were scattered. But on the other hand, anyone in our day would still understand that even though there's Americans all over the world, it's the United States that is the home of the Americans. And so when it says the Americans, it's pointing to the United States. It's not pointing to the entire world. So we're not trying to find every little part of the world where any of these peoples, a couple tribes could have lived. We're trying to understand the names as they would have been understood by Ezekiel, okay? Now, the other issue, though, is, but where did they primarily live in Ezekiel's day? So those are really the two factors that we need to be sort of trying to understand. Now, all of that said, I just received a book in the mail just a couple days ago called Mistaken Identity, The Case Against the Islamic Antichrist by S. Douglas Woodward. Now, Doug is an acquaintance. Can't say we're great friends, but I've begun to get to know Doug. We actually did 3 radio programs together just recently where we had sort of a friendly fireside chat. Now, this was hosted by Southwest radio host Larry Sparmagino. And they were very enjoyable programs. And if you're a Bible prophecy guy, I'll put up the links. You can watch these shows. They'll be airing. We filmed them as well as got the audio. But we had just a real friendly discussion about this issue of, could the Antichrist come from the Middle East? Or is he going to be this popularly understood revived Roman European leader? So this was an enjoyable show, but it was just after the show that I actually got the book, Mistaken Identity. So what I want to do is I want to work through some of the material that's in here because I have, over the years, I've looked at and written articles and tried to share with you all dozens upon dozens of examples of scholarly references that point over and over and over again to Turkey as the head, as the leader of the coming Ezekiel invasion. So the first map I just want to look at before we jump into Doug's book is a map that comes from the IVP Atlas of Bible History. So again, I've got a big old stack of Bible atlases, but this is a great one, one that I would definitely recommend. So what does the IVP Atlas of Bible History say? Well, if we look at the map, it says that Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah are all in modern-day Turkey. So how would Ezekiel have understood these names? Again, he would have looked to the region of Asia Minor, the region that today we refer to as Turkey. Well, what's the second resource? Well, then we've got the New Moody Atlas of the Bible, another fantastic resource. If you want to just grab yourself a few Bible atlases, this is one that I would definitely recommend. Again, where does the New Moody Atlas of the Bible place Magog, Meshech, Tubal, all of these names? Once again, clearly in Asia Minor in Turkey. What about the Holman Bible Atlas? Another great resource, highly recommend. The Holman Bible Atlas, just like those before, also place Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah in Asia Minor, Turkey. And then finally, we have the Zondervan Atlas of the Bible. Again, another great resource. Once more, places all of the peoples primarily in Turkey, Asia Minor. And we could look at numerous others. The Oxford Bible Atlas places Meshech and Tubal. It says they are regions of Asia Minor. The Zondervan Illustrated Bible Dictionary states that Magog is possibly the land of Gog, no doubt, in Asia Minor, and it may refer to Lydia, which was a kingdom in the western portion of Asia Minor. The IVP Bible Background Commentary, it lists Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah as sections or peoples in Asia Minor. The New Unger's Bible Dictionary, under the entry for Magog, it states, it is clear that Lydia is meant, and that by Magog we must understand the land of Gog. The Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary places Magog in Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey. Okay, so I could literally go on and on and on for probably the rest of the show. But I want to go ahead and look at a chart that Doug has placed in the back of his book, because what he's done is he's really made this extensive chart, and he's listed numerous references, and he's called the chart Historical References to Gog and Magog. This is his Appendix 2. So I want to go through some of these historical references. The first one that Doug lists is, he says that Assyrian inscriptions, they record references to Mat Gugai, and he says that's a country of Gugu. Now, the problem with that is that when you read most of the commentaries, Bible dictionaries, and so forth, they'll say that this was probably a reference to Lydia, a reference to the king of Lydia. But then he goes on and he says this: the Magogians and Scythians became one people. That may or may not be the case. In fact, later in the 1st century, which is about almost 1,000 years before these Assyrian inscriptions, Josephus does make the statement that the Magog peoples became the Scythians. There is no reference anywhere in any Assyrian inscriptions that say that the Magogians and the Scythians became one. So by putting this here, inferring that these ancient Assyrian inscriptions state this, it doesn't exist. And I'll challenge Doug, I'll challenge anyone who wants to study this to find me the reference. And again, I could be wrong. Everyone makes mistakes, and this is, no question about it. But I want to lay down the challenge and say, show me where Assyrian inscriptions say that the Magogians and the Scythians became one people, because there's no such reference. Now, the next reference that Doug gives us is Homer, and he says from the Iliad, and he says that Homer refers to these people known as the Hippomolgi. The Hippomolgi. And what he says is this means Scythian, and he has it in quotes, Scythian drinkers of mare milk. Now, in the Greek, hippo is horse, and molgai simply means milker. So you have this reference in Homer's Iliad, which says the horse milkers. The problem is there's no connection to Magog. There's no direct connection to Magog. What he actually says is, he says, that he put as in parentheses, he says Greek is for horse, and Molgai is perhaps a transliteration of Magog. No, Molgai is simply a transliteration of milker. In modern day Greek, it's armigos. Armigos is milker. And so all it means is horse milker. It doesn't mean the Magog horse peoples. And so again, this is sort of reading something into Homer that's simply not there. Now, stepping forward to Hesiod. Now, again, when I did a lot of my primary research some years ago, I got Hesiod's book. Now, Hesiod has he was the father of Greek didactic poetry, right? Hesiod has 2 primary works. He has Theogony, and he has another work called Works and Days. Now, all I can say is this, is that in reading Doug's chart here, this is what Doug says. He says, Hesiod identified, and I'm quoting, identified Magog with the Scythians living in southern Russia. Now, Hesiod wrote about 50 years before Ezekiel. If Hesiod identified Magog with the Scythians living in southern Russia, this would be a huge historical proof for his case. The problem is, it doesn't exist. There is no such reference anywhere in Hesiod to him referring to Magog or the Scythians living in southern Russia. It doesn't exist. I want to, again, extend the challenge. Show me where I'm wrong. I could be wrong. It doesn't exist. I have poured through his works. I have digital copies. I've done multiple keyword searches, and I've read every single page. So again, take my black magic marker and just kind of cross out. I'm just going down this list and crossing them out. Now, the next major individual that Doug quotes is Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is a great source. He wrote extensively about the Scythian peoples. But what does Doug say here? He says that Herodotus mentions a group of people called the Gargarians living in the Caucasus, again, Georgia or that area. The problem is, once again, there is no such reference in all of Herodotus's works to any people known as the Gargarians. It's in Doug's book here. It is not in Herodotus. I want to extend the challenge. Prove me wrong, please. Again, I could be wrong. I have scoured this up, down, backwards, and sideways. I mean, a few years ago I did this, and I could not find it. Now, what I did find is Herodotus making reference to a people known as the Gandarians. Very different than the Gagarenes, the Gandarians. But what does Herodotus say? He says the Gandarians lived in Asia. Asia, that's the Greek word for Asia Minor. That's Turkey, okay? So there is no such, again, he says that Herodotus mentioned the Gargarians, assuming that they are the Gagarenes or the Gogians, the Magogians, that lived up in southern Russia. There's no such reference. It doesn't exist. Now, what Herodotus does is he discusses, because Herodotus lived about 150 years after Ezekiel. Okay, so please follow this. Herodotus lived about 150 years after Ezekiel, and he traces three different theories in terms of where the Scythian peoples came from. Now, assuming that Magog and the Scythians are one and the same, because this is wildly debated among scholars. Many people say Scythian is just a very broad term that could have referred to any number of nomadic tribal peoples. But let's just assume it is. Herodotus goes through the various three theories, and then after he completes them all, he gets to the third one, and this is what he says. He says, he lists two, and he says, there is also another different story, now to be related, in which I am more inclined to put faith than in any other. In other words, he goes, this third theory, this is the one that I believe. This is the one that I'm much more inclined to put my faith in than any other. And he says, it is that the wandering Scythian once dwelt in Asia. So here he is writing 150 years after Ezekiel, and he says, I believe that the Scythians dwelt in Turkey. So the question is, if they once dwelt in Turkey, they had left, where did they live in Ezekiel's day? And so a few years ago, what I did is I wrote back and forth with a scholar of this whole subject, of this whole period. His name is Michael Kulikowski. He's the department head of history at Penn State University. So we had a little email back and forth. And this is what he said. He said Herodotus's Scythians, okay, so the Scythians of Herodotus's day, they were to be found in a bit of modern Bulgaria, Romania, across the grasslands of Moldova and Ukraine. In other words, it was during Ezekiel's day that the Scythians lived in Turkey. But then the Medo-Persians, we know the story in the book of Daniel, right? The Medo-Persians then began to conquer Babylon. They swept through and they pushed the Scythians out of Asia Minor. So here we were, according to this guy who is a scholar of this subject, and he says that 150 years after Ezekiel, the Scythians had begun to make their way around the Black Sea, but they had not even reached Russia yet. They were in Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, heading up to the Ukraine, but they hadn't even reached those southern steppes of Russia yet. And so again, we need to submit to what history tells us, not just sort of make stuff up or try to manipulate the data. Okay, the evidence points to the Scythians, if they were the Magogians, living in Asia during Ezekiel's day. Now, what is the next reference that Doug includes? He says Philo of Alexandria. Now, look at this. This is a big one. He says Philo of Alexandria identified Magog with southern Russia. Friends, again, I want to extend the challenge. Show me the quote. Show me the quote in Philo, because nowhere in Philo does he mention Magog as dwelling in southern Russia. Nowhere. You can take a black magic marker and cross this right out. This claim, it doesn't exist. Now, I looked it up, I scoured it, and this is the only place I could conclude that the reference may have come from, is you have a work called the Biblical Antiquities of Philo. The problem is this was not written by Philo. that if you do your homework, this was written by someone known as Pseudo-Philo. He was a Philo pretender, and he wrote in the 1st century. And he doesn't say anything about Magog being identified with southern Russia. He does mention Magog twice, and he identifies him as a descendant of Noah. That's it. Okay, so there's all these quotes, these historical claims. They don't exist. They're just made up. Where did this all come from? I can tell you because I've done the research. It comes from a website created by a guy named Tim Osterholm. And he puts together this big website, and he does a lot of good research. The problem is he is pulling from another book written by another individual, and it's simply not true. So this is the problem, is when you start quoting someone, you have to look up the original resources. You have to look them up and say, is this guy being truthful? You can't just recycle information, because when one person is dishonest or fudges the information, this information gets passed on. And I see it on the internet. I even see it in books quite frequently. All of the quotes that I've referred to so far, they don't exist. Finally, another big one is Doug says that Strabo is a Greek historian who lived in the 1st century. He says that Strabo mentions the Gagarenes. Okay, so you could say Gagarene, that's pretty close to Gog Magog. That Gagarene is a region in the present-day Armenia and Georgia. So this is what Doug says, Armenia and Georgia. So that's bordering on southern Russia, right? Now, and then he says, scholars say that Gagarene best preserved the name of Magog. Now, if you were to look up in this book by Sverre Bo, he's a Norwegian scholar who did his thesis, his PhD thesis on the issue of Gog Magog. This is one of those monographs that you pay all kinds of money for, but it's filled with fantastic information. On page 209 of his book, this is what Mr. Bo says. He says, Gagarene, he says, Strabo refers in his geography to a northern area of Armenia bordering on the Iberian areas under the name Gagarene. And then what does he say? In modern categories, we are speaking of areas in Turkey, Georgia, and Armenia. Okay, so again, even the information that is quoted that is accurate is sort of fudged. It's fudged to sort of point to Russia. But in fact, Gagarene included areas of Turkey. But again, this is 500, 600 years after Ezekiel. So yes, the people had migrated, but the question is, where did they live in Ezekiel's day? Friends, this is all the time that we have. I've gone way over as usual. Listen, we need to be responsible students of the Scriptures. We need to be responsible students of the Scriptures. If you want to teach on these issues, you have to go back to the original sources. Over and over and over again, they point to Turkey. They don't point to Russia. And, my point here is not to, it's not to speak negatively about Doug in any way, shape, or form. It's just that when you're critiquing something, you can't simply take some article off the internet and publish it. You have to do the original research. So listen, friends, this is all the time that we have for this week. I want to thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to seeing you next week. I'm Joel Richardson, and this is The Underground.